My name is Angela Turner. I am 32 years old, and until that Thursday evening, I believed the locks on my home were enough to keep my parents out of my life. I was wrong. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw their silver sedan at the curb. They did not wave or get out. They waited until I noticed the wrapped box on my doorstep, then drove away. A white card had been tied beneath the ribbon with 4 words in my mother's handwriting: "Don't make a scene." I should have left it untouched, but the warning felt like another command from childhood. I carried the box into the entryway and cut the ribbon. The first thing I saw was a photograph of my son asleep in his own bedroom. The second was a duplicate key to our house. Beneath those sat a thick envelope stamped with the name of a family court attorney. My knees nearly gave out. I dialed 911 before reading another page. 2 officers arrived within minutes, separated the contents, and told me not to touch anything else. That was when my husband came through the front door. He stopped at the sight of the uniforms, looked at the open box, and turned pale. "Please don't tell me," he whispered. "They actually did it." His words frightened me more than the photograph, because they meant he knew something I did not. Before I tell you what the officers found beneath those papers, and why my husband looked like he had seen a ghost, tell me, what time is it where you are right now? Where are you watching from, and what is the weather like there? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. My husband's name was Mark, and the moment he said those words, both officers turned toward him. I did too. For several seconds he seemed unable to decide whether to look at me, or the open box. Finally he pointed to the envelope, and asked whether anyone had removed the documents. One officer told him no. Mark swallowed and said, 3 weeks ago her father asked me to sign something. He said it was an emergency guardianship plan in case Angela and I were ever both hospitalized. I refused. I stared at him. He had never mentioned that conversation. Mark explained that my father, Frank, had approached him outside his office speaking calmly, almost casually, as if he were discussing insurance. When Mark demanded to know why such a document was necessary, Frank said my mother, Nancy, believed I had become emotionally unstable, and that someone responsible needed to be prepared. Mark had told him to stay away from us. Frank had smiled and replied, "You may not get to make that decision." Mark had kept quiet because he thought telling me would reopen wounds I had spent years trying to close. I wanted to be angry with him, but the box was sitting between us like proof that silence had only given my parents more room to move. The older officer introduced himself as Officer Ramirez and pulled on gloves. Under the family court envelope, he found a small digital recorder, a flash drive, 6 photographs, a child's wooden train, and a stuffed bear I recognized immediately. The train belonged to my 8-year-old son Nathan. The bear had disappeared after our last visit to my parents' home 4 months earlier. When Ramirez lifted it, a familiar floral scent drifted into the room. My mother's perfume. The same perfume that used to linger outside my bedroom whenever she listened through the door. For one sharp instant, I was 16 again, hiding college applications beneath my mattress because Nancy had already chosen the school she expected me to attend. That memory did not arrive as a complete scene. It came as pressure in my chest, the click of a doorknob, and her voice asking why a daughter who loved her family needed secrets. The photographs were worse. One showed Nathan sleeping. Another showed him eating breakfast at our kitchen island. A third had been taken through the fence behind his school. The dates printed in the corners covered nearly 2 months. In one image, the reflection in the window caught part of the photographer's face. It was not Nancy or Frank. It was a man I did not recognize. Officer Ramirez stopped treating the package like an ugly family dispute. He called a supervisor, requested an evidence technician, and asked whether my parents had ever possessed a key to our home. I told him Frank had helped us replace a back door lock the year before. We had changed the front lock after cutting contact, but not the back one. Mark closed his eyes. Neither of us needed to say what that meant. The envelope contained a draft petition asking a court to grant my parents temporary control over Nathan. Most of it was unsigned, but several attached statements had already been prepared. According to them, I had missed medical appointments, left Nathan unattended, threatened relatives, and suffered unpredictable episodes that made our home unsafe. None of it was true. One seemed carried but looked like Mark's signature. He leaned over the page and said, "That is not mine." Another page appeared to be a letter from a therapist I had never met. It described private sessions that had never happened, and recommended that Nathan be removed from my care before an avoidable crisis occurred. The language was polished, professional, and terrifying, because it had been designed to sound reasonable. Ramirez asked about the recorder. Mark recognized the model. 2 months earlier he had found a device just like it beneath the passenger seat of our car. He assumed it belonged to a co-worker who had ridden with him, but when he later asked, the co-worker denied ever seeing it. Mark had thrown it away. This recorder had a strip of black adhesive on the back, and a label reading Kitchen 2. Officer Ramirez placed it in an evidence bag without switching it on. Kitchen 2 suggests there may have been a Kitchen 1, he said. The sentence changed the air in our home. The officers asked permission to conduct a protective sweep for obvious surveillance devices, while they waited for the technician. Mark and I agreed. They found a tiny camera inside a smoke detector facing the kitchen table. Another device had been fed behind a vent in the hallway near Nathan's room. The camera was not connected to our Wi-Fi. It stored footage locally on a memory card, which meant whoever installed it had expected to return and retrieve it. The officers also found faint scratches around the back door lock. I remembered my mother appearing at Nathan's school fundraiser 2 weeks earlier, smiling as if our estrangement were merely a temporary misunderstanding. She had hugged me before I could step away. At the time, I thought she wanted to embarrass me in public. Now I wondered whether Frank had entered our home while she kept us occupied. The evidence technician photographed everything. Ramirez warned us that the forged documents alone did not prove who created them, and that family court papers could be drafted without ever being filed. He also said the photographs, duplicate key, and hidden devices created a much more serious picture. He advised us not to confront my parents, not to post online, and not to tell anyone what had been found. Then he asked whether we had somewhere else to stay that night. Mark's sister lived across the bay, but leaving felt like surrendering our home. Still, I packed one bag for Nathan and one for us. Nathan was at a friend's supervised birthday dinner, and Mark arranged for his sister to collect him without explaining the details over the phone. Before we left, Ramirez handed me a property receipt and asked one final question. "Did your parents know your husband would be home late tonight?" I said yes. Nancy had called Mark's office that morning pretending to confirm a dinner invitation. Ramirez looked at the placement of the box, then at the open front door. "They may have expected you to open this alone," he said. I understood the message hidden beneath the ribbon at last. "Don't make a scene," had not been a warning to stay calm. It had been an instruction to remain isolated. As we stepped outside, the technician emerged from the hallway holding a third evidence bag. Inside was a memory card labeled with my name and a date from 6 years earlier. The week Nathan was born. We spent that night at Mark's sister's house, but I did not sleep. Every sound from the hallway made me imagine a key turning in our back door. Nathan was told that a pipe problem had forced us out for the night. He accepted the explanation, curled up on the couch, and asked whether his grandparents knew where we were. The question was innocent, but it revealed how often Nancy had inserted herself into his world. I told him they did not, then sat beside him until his breathing became slow and even. Across the room, Mark watched me with guilt written across his face. When Nathan was asleep, Mark apologized for hiding Frank's approach. I told him I was hurt, but I also understood why he had hesitated. My parents had trained everyone around them to manage my reactions, instead of confronting their behavior. That pattern ended that night. The next morning, Officer Ramirez called us back to the station. The memory card labeled with the week of Nathan's birth had not come from any device in our current home. It contained scanned documents, voice recordings, and photographs, collected over 6 years. The earliest recording was a conversation between Nancy and me in the hospital after Nathan was born. I remembered the conversation, but I had never known it was recorded. Nancy had urged me to sign a temporary medical authorization, because I was exhausted after delivery. I refused. On the audio, she sounded gentle and concerned. After I left the room, Frank's voice appeared. He said, "She will come around when she realizes how little control she has." Hearing that sentence years later was like discovering a trapdoor beneath a familiar floor. The card also contained copies of our tax returns, Mark's work schedule, Nathan's school calendar, and notes about arguments Mark and I had in private. Most of the notes were ordinary details twisted into accusations. A cancelled dentist appointment became medical neglect. A babysitter arriving 10 minutes late became child left unsupervised. A photograph of me drinking 1 glass of wine at a holiday dinner was labeled substance concern. My parents had not been documenting danger. They had been manufacturing a story. Ramirez introduced us to Detective Lena Cho, who handled stalking and electronic surveillance cases. She was careful not to promise an arrest. She explained that the digital files would need authentication, and that the hidden devices had to be traced. She also warned us that Frank had already called the department. He claimed the box was a family archive delivered during a disagreement, and accused me of overreacting because of long-standing emotional problems. He had given the name of a retired captain, who would supposedly confirm that Frank was an honorable community member. The move was so predictable that it almost calmed me. He had not asked whether I was safe. He had gone straight to controlling the narrative. Detective Cho recommended immediate lock changes, a school security alert, and a temporary civil restraining order. Our attorney, Melissa Grant, met us that afternoon. She reviewed the fake guardianship petition and noticed something the rest of us had missed. The supposed therapist's license number belonged to a real professional, but the name on the wire did not match the state registry. The notarization stamp on Mark's forged statement was also genuine, yet it had been reported stolen 3 months earlier. Someone had built the file from pieces of real identities, hoping no one would inspect them closely. Melissa advised us not to visit my parents. Instead, she drafted a formal notice ordering them to stop contacting us, approaching Nathan's school, entering our property, or using our personal records. Mark wanted to send it immediately. I asked for 10 minutes alone. In the conference room, I stared at the page and remembered being 22, standing in my parents' kitchen with an acceptance letter to a graduate program in another state. Frank had taken the letter from my hand, folded it twice, and said the family had already invested enough in my experiments. Nancy had cried until I agreed to stay in San Francisco. For years, I described that decision as my own, because admitting the truth felt more humiliating. Now the same people were trying to turn my adulthood into another document they could rewrite. I signed the notice. That evening, Detective Cho called with the first major break. A serial number from the hallway camera led to a local security installer. The buyer had paid cash, but the store's surveillance footage showed the purchaser clearly. It was the unknown man reflected in the school photograph. His name was Calvin Reese, a private investigator whose license had been suspended after complaints involving illegal tracking. Phone records obtained through an emergency preservation request showed repeated contact between Reese and a number registered to Frank's business. Cho told us not to celebrate. Contact was not proof of conspiracy, and Reese might claim he had been hired only for lawful observation. Then she added that officers had visited his listed address and found the office empty. He had cleared out overnight. An hour later, Nancy sent me a voice message. She did not mention the police or the box. She said she had heard Nathan might be missing school, and offered to collect him until things settled down. Her tone was warm, almost maternal. At the end, she lowered her voice and said, "A judge will care about stability, Angela. Think carefully before you make yourself look unstable." I forwarded the message to Detective Cho without replying. For the first time, I did not hear my mother as an all-powerful figure. I heard a woman following a script. Then Melissa called. The fake emergency petition was no longer merely a draft. Someone had attempted to file it that morning. The attempted filing forced everything into the open. Melissa obtained a copy from the courthouse, and discovered that Frank and Nancy were asking for an emergency order before I could be notified. Their petition claimed Mark and I had disappeared with Nathan after a domestic crisis, that police had visited our home because I was behaving irrationally, and that my parents were the only relatives capable of providing immediate stability. They had transformed their call for help into evidence against us. Attached were the forged therapist letter, Mark's false signature, carefully cropped photographs, and a declaration from Calvin Reese describing himself only as a family safety consultant. The petition requested temporary guardianship, access to Nathan's school records, and possession of our home keys. Melissa filed an opposition before the assigned judge reviewed the request. Because the petition involved alleged immediate risk, the court scheduled a hearing for the following afternoon. Detective Cho could not tell the judge what conclusions the criminal investigation would reach, but she provided a declaration confirming that hidden cameras, a duplicate key, and suspected forged documents had been collected from our home. Officer Ramirez's body camera timestamps prove that police had responded to evidence we reported, not to a disturbance caused by me. My parents arrived at court dressed as if they were attending a charity luncheon. Nancy wore pale blue and carried a folder against her chest. Fang greeted two attorneys in the hallway and nodded to a clerk who seemed to recognize him. When he saw me, he did not look ashamed or frightened. He looked disappointed, the way he had looked when I brought home a grade he considered beneath me. Nancy took one step toward Nathan, who was waiting with Mark's sister farther down the corridor, but a court officer stopped her because of the temporary no-contact request. Her expression changed for only a second. The sweetness vanished, and something cold appeared beneath it. Inside the courtroom, their attorney described them as devoted grandparents responding to alarming information. He called the box a clumsy attempt to share family records, and said the photographs had been taken to document Nathan's routine. Because my parents feared neglect, he portrayed the key as an old spare accidentally left among returned belongings. Every violation became concern. Every lie became misunderstanding. Then Melissa placed the actual photographs beside the versions attached to the petition. The originals showed date stamps and wider backgrounds. One image my parents had labeled, Nathan wandering alone outside school, revealed, when uncropped, Mark standing only a few feet away. Another labeled Angela intoxicated at a family gathering, showed a birthday toast, with 6 other adults holding identical glasses. The judge asked why the images had been altered. My parents' attorney requested time to consult his clients. Fang whispered to him, but Nancy interrupted. She stood and said she could explain. The judge ordered her to sit unless called. Yet Nancy kept talking. She said I had always been impulsive, that Mark was weak, and that someone had to plan for Nathan's future. She insisted the family could not wait for me to collapse. Melissa asked whether Nancy had authorized anyone to enter our home. Their attorney objected, but the judge allowed a limited answer because the petition requested access to the property. Nancy looked directly at me and said, "A mother does what is necessary when her daughter refuses help." It was not a complete confession, but it was enough to destroy the careful image she had brought into the room. Frank grabbed her arm and told her to stop. The judge noticed. So did the court reporter. Melissa then presented a voicemail in which Nancy warned that a judge would care about stability. Because Nancy had sent it directly to me, there was no recording consent issue. The judge listened twice. After the second playback, he denied the emergency guardianship request, prohibited my parents from contacting Nathan or approaching his school, and referred the suspicious documents to the court's fraud unit. He also ordered that no future petition from them be considered without notice to us. Outside the courtroom, Frank finally lost his composure. He stepped close enough that the court officer moved between us. "You have no idea where you've started," he said. "People know us. They know what kind of daughter you are." For most of my life, that sentence would have silenced me. Instead, I answered, "Then let them see the evidence." Nancy began crying, but there were no tears on her cheeks. She told Mark he was allowing me to ruin Nathan's relationship with his grandparents. Mark replied that they had ruined it themselves when they entered our home. Frank's face tightened. "You cannot prove who entered that house," he said. Detective Cho, who had been waiting near the elevators, spoke from behind him. "We're working on that." Frank turned and saw her badge. For the first time, confidence left his face. Cho asked both of my parents to come to the station voluntarily. Their attorney refused on their behalf, and hurried them away. As they entered the elevator, Nancy stared at me with open hatred. The doors closed, but not before she lifted her phone and typed something. Less than 5 minutes later, every member of our extended family received a message claiming I had suffered a breakdown, manipulated the police, and tried to have my loving parents arrested. What Nancy did not know was that she had attached the wrong file. Beneath her message was a photograph of our kitchen taken from the hidden camera. Nancy tried to delete the family message, but too many people had already downloaded the attachment. My cousin sent me a screenshot before I even reached the parking garage. The image showed our kitchen from the angle of the camera hidden inside the smoke detector. In the corner, a timestamp placed the photograph 3 weeks before the box appeared. Nancy had just connected herself to evidence she had insisted was a misunderstanding. Detective Cho asked every recipient to preserve the original message. By evening, the court's fraud investigator, the district attorney's office, and the police cyber unit were all examining the same file. The embedded data showed that the photograph had been exported from a folder named Angela Home Monitoring. The device history linked that folder to a laptop registered to Frank's consulting company. Frank could still argue that another person had used the computer, but the wall around him had begun to crack. The next morning, officers executed search warrants at my parents' house and Frank's office. Cho later told us only what the law allowed her to share. They recovered copies of our house key, invoices from Calvin Reese, a stolen notary seal, surveillance equipment, and several binders labeled with dates from my childhood. One binder contained reports on Mark's job, our neighbors, Nathan's teachers, and members of my extended family who might support or oppose my parents. Another contained drafts of anonymous complaints prepared for Nathan's school, Mark's employer, and child welfare authorities. The complaints had not all been sent, but they showed a coordinated plan. Isolate us, damage our credibility, then present my parents as the solution. Calvin Reese was found 2 days later at a motel outside Sacramento. Faced with records tying him to the cameras and photographs, he agreed to cooperate. He admitted Frank had paid him to observe our home and install recording devices. He also said Nancy had provided schedules and distracted us during the school fundraiser. Reese claimed he never agreed to enter Nathan's room, but digital evidence placed one of his devices there. His attempt to protect himself only supplied investigators with more detail. My parents were arrested the following week. Frank faced allegations involving burglary, stalking, conspiracy, forgery, identity misuse, and illegal surveillance. Nancy faced many of the same allegations, along with attempted fraud on the court. Their attorney released a statement calling the arrests an unfortunate criminalization of a private family disagreement. That statement lasted less than a day before local reporters obtained the court order and portions of the public filing. The social consequences came quickly. Frank was placed on leave from the non-profit board he had chaired for 12 years. 2 organizations removed his name from upcoming fundraisers. Nancy's church committee asked her to step aside while the case was pending. Fans who accepted her version began forwarding us old messages, in which she had asked suspicious questions about our schedule, our marriage, and Nathan's school. Each forwarded message became another thread in the pattern. I did not celebrate their humiliation. I was too busy understanding the size of what they had built. Melissa helped us file a civil case for invasion of privacy, emotional distress, trespass, and costs related to securing our home. We replaced every lock, camera, computer, and phone. Mark changed his work routines. Nathan's school added photographs of my parents to his restricted contact file. The expenses were enormous, but for the first time, every step we took created distance instead of fear. Nancy was released before trial under strict conditions. She was worried not to contact us directly or indirectly. Frank had to surrender his passport and was barred from accessing company devices. Through relatives, they continued insisting they had acted out of love. I gave the same response each time. Love does not require forged signatures, hidden cameras, or a stolen key. 3 weeks later, a floral arrangement arrived at Mark's sister's house. There was no sender's name. The card read, "Families forgive." Detective Cho traced the purchase to a prepaid card, but store footage showed Nancy standing at the register. It was a deliberate violation of the no-contact order. Cho arrested her again that afternoon. As Nancy was light from the courthouse after her release was revoked, she saw me across the lobby. She did not plead or pretend. She mouthed 4 words. "You did this to us." I finally understood the difference between guilt and responsibility. I had not done this to them. I had simply stopped preventing the consequences. The criminal case took 9 months to reach its final stage. During that time, my parents used every legal delay available to them. Frank changed attorneys twice. Nancy requests medical accommodations. Then appeared social events telling people the charges were destroying her health. Their supporters sent letters describing them as generous, respectable people who had devoted their lives to family. The prosecutor answered with photographs, devices, payment records, forged documents, and Nancy's own message containing the hidden camera image. The binders taken from their house revealed something even more personal. For years, Frank had kept copies of letters addressed to me. Among them was the acceptance packet from the graduate program I thought I had declined. A second letter showed that the program had offered financial aid after I asked to defer. I had never seen it. Nancy had called the admissions office pretending to be me, and withdrawn my application permanently. Another folder contained emails Frank sent to a former boyfriend, warning him that I was unstable and would ruin his career. My parents had not begun controlling me when Nathan was born. They had simply expanded a system that had worked for most of my life. Melissa asked whether I wanted those details included in our civil case. I said yes. Not because a court could return the opportunities they stole, but because I was done helping them preserve a false history. Mark read every document with me. Sometimes I became angry. Sometimes I felt nothing at all. The hardest moments were the ones in which I recognized my own old words repeated back by Nancy. That I was too sensitive, too impulsive, too dependent to make major decisions. I had spent years speaking about myself in my mother's language. Nathan knew only what was appropriate for his age. We told him his grandparents had broken serious rules, that adults were handling it, and that none of it was his fault. He asked whether they loved him. I said I believed they felt something they called love, but love without respect could become possession. He was quiet, then said he did not want anyone taking pictures through his window again. That simple sentence became part of the impact statement Melissa helped us prepare. When trial approached, Calvin Reese agreed to testify. The forensic evidence showed his equipment had entered our house multiple times. Phone location records placed Frank nearby during 2 of those entries, while Nancy's messages proved she had arranged distractions. The forged therapist letter was traced to a template found on Frank's laptop. Mark's copied signature had been lifted from a contractor agreement. The stolen notary seal was recovered from a locked drawer in Nancy's sewing room. Faced with that evidence, both of my parents accepted plea agreements. Frank pleaded guilty to charges that included residential burglary, stalking, conspiracy, and forgery. Nancy pleaded guilty to stalking, conspiracy, attempted court fraud, and violating the protective order. At sentencing, Frank asked the judge to consider his service to the community. The judge replied that public trust made his conduct more serious, not less. Frank received a multi-year prison sentence followed by a supervised release. Nancy received county custody, intensive probation, mandatory treatment, and a long-term protective order forbidding contact with us. The court also ordered restitution for our security costs and legal expenses. Their financial image collapsed with the case. Frank's company lost major clients and closed. Their civil insurer refused to cover intentional misconduct. To satisfy legal fees, restitution, and the settlement of our civil claims, they sold the large house where I had grown up. The nonprofit removed Frank permanently, and issued an apology to donors. Nancy lost the social circle she had used as an audience for her version of our family. On sentencing day, she turned toward me and whispered, "Was it worth destroying everything?" I answered quietly, "I didn't destroy it. I opened the box." That was the last direct conversation we ever had. A year after the sentencing, our house no longer felt like a place under observation. The back door had been replaced, the hallway fan repaired, and the smoke detector changed twice before I stopped looking at it whenever I entered the kitchen. Healing did not arrive as one dramatic moment. It appeared in ordinary things. Leaving my phone on the counter without checking for messages, watching Nathan walk into school without scanning the parking lot, and disagreeing with Mark without hearing my father's voice predicting our marriage would fail. Mark and I also repaired the silence between us. He promised never again to protect me by withholding information, and I promised to tell him when old fear was shaping a new decision. We attended counseling, not because my parents' forged letter had been right, but because real support is chosen, honest, and accountable. That distinction mattered to me. Nancy had used the idea of mental health as a weapon, I refused to let her turn asking for help into something shameful. The civil settlement paid our remaining security expenses and created an education fund for Nathan. I did not want money from my parents to feel like a reward, so we treated it as restoration. Part of the settlement also required them to surrender every photograph, recording, copy of a key, and document connected to us. Detective Cho supervised the transfer. There were 12 boxes. I did not open most of them. Melissa arranged for a digital forensics company to identify anything necessary for our records, and destroy the rest. One small envelope was returned to me because it contained my original graduate school acceptance letter. I held it for a long time. The paper was yellowed at the edges, but my name was still clear. At 33, I applied to a local graduate program in the same field. When the acceptance email arrived, I read it aloud to Mark and Nathan. No one took it from my hands. Extended family members reacted in different ways. Some apologized for believing Nancy. Others said they wanted to remain neutral, as though hidden cameras and forged court documents were merely two sides of a disagreement. I stopped arguing with them. Neutrality had been the space in which my parents operated best. Anyone who required me to minimize the truth in order to keep family peace no longer had a central place in my life. Nathan eventually asked whether he would ever see his grandparents again. I told him the protective order would remain, and that when he was older, he could discuss his feelings with us and qualified professionals. I did not ask him to hate them. Hatred would have kept them present in a different form. I wanted him to understand boundaries, evidence, and the difference between forgiveness and access. Forgiveness can be personal. Access must be earned. Sometimes people call what happened revenge. I understand why. Frank lost his freedom, business, home, and reputation. Nancy lost her social standing, control over our family, and the audience that once accepted every story she told. Their punishment was severe. But I never planted evidence, spread rumors, or engineered their collapse. I preserved what they sent, reported what they did, and refused to retreat when they tried to make me doubt myself. The truth created consequences they had spent years avoiding. The wrapped box remained in police evidence until the case closed. When it was finally released, I asked for only the warning card. I framed it beside my graduate school acceptance letter. "Don't make a scene" now hangs beneath proof that I reclaimed the decision they once stole from me. The words no longer sound like an order. They remind me of the exact moment obedience ended. So here's the lesson I carried from that doorstep. When controlling people tell you to stay quiet, they are often protecting the story that gives them power. Document the facts. Ask for help. Build boundaries that have consequences. And never confuse family loyalty with permission to invade your life. Would you have opened that box, or would you have called the police before touching it? Either way, trust the moment when concern becomes control. That moment may be the beginning of your freedom. Thank you for watching another story from our channel. Everything in this video is usually made only for entertainment, education, and refreshing. We all be reminded that healing becomes easier when you stop measuring your progress by what someone regrets hearing you, and start measuring it by how peaceful your life has become relevant.